everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Yeah, there's an interesting bit of a backstory for this presentation that I'd like to start with. Anjali and Anjali asked me to write a book chapter for her book on advances in simulation and modeling. And I wrote a book chapter on system dynamics, and I guess she liked the book chapter enough to invite me to come to this presentation to talk about system dynamics to the Canadian Operations Research Society. And I asked her, well, I have many things I could talk about. I wonder what I should talk about. So she looked at my YouTube channel and she picked this subject, which is System Dynamics Archetypes. And I said to myself, when she picked it, I said, gosh, that's a really tough subject to talk to Canadian Operations Research Society about, because it's purely qualitative. And as Yaseri did his very highly quantitative work in the previous presentation, my presentation is going to be very light in terms of no mathematics at all, and just qualitative diagrams. So I'm a little bit embarrassed by the fact that Anjali didn't pick out one of my more quantitative modeling exercises where I use system dynamics. I guess another aspect of this is that yes, I was in the operational research organization in national defense for 33 years. And about the last 15 years of my time there, I was trying to get the operational research organization interested in system dynamics. And I pretty much failed miserably. I tried to teach people system dynamics in short courses, and basically I couldn't get any traction at all in getting them to use system dynamics. And when I retired in 2012, I decided to spend my full-time effort in system dynamics, and I'm working in this company Policy Dynamics right now. So anyways, going back to this presentation, as I said, this is on System Dynamics Archetypes, and it's applied to defensive and offensive security. And so when Anjali asked me to give this presentation, I'm not really an expert in archetypes, and I'm not an expert in security. However, Keith Willett, who is the lead author on this presentation, who's not here, he's in California, and he wrote his PhD dissertation and included archetypes in his PhD dissertation. And together, he and I wrote a book chapter for a book called The Handbook of Security Sciences. And we included the archetypes in that chapter, and then we went on to write a paper for the International Council on Systems Engineering International Symposium last year on system dynamics and security, but more of a quantitative model. So, anyways, this is primarily Keith Willett's work. So, I may not be able to answer all your questions today, and I may have to direct them to Keith for him to get back to you. However, after Anjali suggested I give this presentation, I contacted Keith and I said, are you interested in helping me on this presentation? And he said, sure. And I said, and then I said, well, why don't we write a paper for the International Council on Systems Engineering International Symposium in Ottawa in July of 2025. And he said, okay, yeah, let's do it. So we wrote a paper for the Systems Engineering International Symposium, and we submitted it. It's under review right now. It hasn't been accepted yet. We're hoping it'll be accepted. And but anyways, if anyone's interested in reading that paper, I can send them to you after this presentation. And just another note is that the background I have today here is Ottawa. You can probably tell it's Ottawa, and that's the Shaw Center, I think it's called, which will be the convention center that will hold the International Council on Systems Engineering's International Symposium in July in Ottawa. So we're all very excited. I'm a member. I'm an executive member of the Canadian chapter of the COSI organization, and we're all very excited to have the International Symposium in Ottawa next year. Okay, with all that, I guess I'll move on to my presentation. So the objectives of the presentation today are to introduce system dynamics modeling in security. And in particular, to explain archetypes and their relevance to security. And archetypes are a specific type of system dynamics modeling. It's a qualitative type of system dynamics modeling. And then I want to talk about the practical applications of archetypes to defensive and offensive security operations. And finally, I'll end with some limitations of this kind of modeling and some areas of future research. Okay, well, as I said, this is going to be completely qualitative, and so I'm not sure if you're all familiar with something called a causal loop diagram. And a causal loop diagram helps to visualize feedback dynamics. And in system dynamics, we believe that we should take a feedback perspective on all systems. And basically, systems are connected, are things that are all connected together. And because they're connected together, there's things that sort of cycle around, and that leads to feedback. So here's a picture of a causal loop diagram, and let me just explain how you read this. So the first thing you'll notice is that there's these positive and negative signs on the arrows. So the arrows mean that there's a causation relationship between the item at the tail and the item at the head. And a positive sign on the head of the arrow means that these two parameters move in the same direction in a cause and effect relationship. So for example, in this case here, we have a gap between the desired state and the current state. And then we see that when we have a gap, that leads to action, and the action leads to improving the current state, and improving the current state leads to closing the gap. So the negative sign on the current state to closing gap is the idea that it's moving in the opposite direction. So so you can trace around these arrows, and then you can see the relationships between these things in a causal way. So it's one way I often explain this to people who aren't familiar with system dynamics is that positive arrows are very similar in many ways to positive correlation, and negative arrows are very similar to negative correlation. However, in system dynamics, we take a bit of offense to thinking about it in those terms, because we concentrate on causation, and we don't like to think about things in terms of correlation. However, obviously, you can't have causation without correlation. So a way I can explain it to, say, a statistician is that this is similar to some extent to a correlation matrix. Okay, now the other thing I want to mention is these double bars over here. You can see them between action and unintended consequences, and they represent delays in the impact of the action and the unintended consequence. There's a delay. So delays are very important, because it makes it difficult to interpret how actions are changing the system. So basically you can imagine say for example in the movie Titanic, they wanted to change the direction of the ship, so they turned the wheel, but the ship didn't turn right away. There was a large delay before it started to turn, and because it didn't turn right away, they couldn't avoid the iceberg. And so that's a real problem, especially for senior leaders in organizations. They expect to see their actions actually result in results right away. and System Dynamics often suggests that, hey, there's going to be delays between the time you implement something and the time it actually takes effect. There's going to be an implementation time. And we have to sometimes try to convince senior leaders to be patient and wait until this action actually can get through the system and take effect. So delays are very difficult things for senior leaders to appreciate, and there's something that System Dynamics tries to convince them to consider important in their decision making. And then finally, we have these feedback loops. And there's two types of feedback loops. There's only two types of feedback loops, which is interesting because there's only two types of connections too. There's the same and opposite. And there's two types of loops. There's a reinforcing loop and a balancing loop. And in a reinforcing loop, you have a situation where a change in one of the variables ripples through the system and causes a further, if it's an increase, it causes a further increase in that variable. And if it's a decrease, it causes a further decrease in that variable. So let's trace this. We label reinforcing loops with an R and a circle. And so let's look at this. So we have a gap, and if the gap increases, then we take action, and the action then could lead to improvements in the current state, or with a delay, it could lead to unintended consequences. And then the unintended consequences cause the current state to decrease. And then the current state decreasing causes the gap to increase. So basically you see that if we increase the gap and went through the loop that was reinforcing, we would increase the gap further because it's a reinforcing loop. And then we can look at the balancing loop here, and we can say that here we have, a gap that leads to an action, and the action leads to an improvement in the current state, and the improvement in the current state leads to a reduction in the gap, and that's a balancing loop. Basically what happens there is if something changes in one direction, say positive, it ripples through the system and comes back with a negative effect on the original variable. And similarly, if it's a decrease in the variable, it ripples through the system and comes back with an increase to the original variable. And that's basically all there is to causal loop diagrams, and it's almost all there is to system dynamics. So archetypes. So archetypes are recurring patterns in systems that highlight common challenges and leverage points. So once you understand archetypes, you'll see them all over the place in all the systems that you're familiar with. So they're very powerful ideas. The other idea is that they're really only just a combination of reinforcing and balancing loops. However, the great thing about archetypes is that they highlight both the intended outcomes and the unintended consequences of actions. So it really addresses this idea that with every action, there's both an intended consequence and an unintended consequence with every action. And so, we may not understand these unintended consequences before they happen. So the idea is maybe archetypes can help us foresee these unintended consequences of our actions, and hopefully, if they're negative unintended consequences, avoid them. Okay, so I'm going to look at 6 archetypes here. I'm going to look at shifting the burden, which is one archetype. These are just different types of archetypes. Tragedy of the commons. Everyone's familiar with the tragedy of the commons archetype. And then fixes that fail is another archetype. Accidental adversaries is another archetype. Drifting goals is another archetype. And that's a very important one that you're probably familiar with. If you've never heard the term, you're familiar with the idea. And the last one is limits to success, which I think is something you can really appreciate from an operational research perspective. Okay, so shifting the burden. So the idea of shifting the burden is that we have an over-reliance on symptomatic fixes that diverts our attention from systemic causes. And here's the archetype in terms of a causal loop diagram, and it involves two balancing loops and a reinforcing loop. So in this case, for a security problem, we have a router failure that is the problem symptom. And then we have two possible solutions to that router failure. The symptomatic solution is to reboot the router, and then that causes the problem to go away. The more fundamental solution is that after a delay, you could have a router reconfiguration and maybe a replacement and improved quality control of the router, which would also make the problem go away. However, we have this side effect, and the side effect is a reinforcing loop. And the reinforcing loop is the idea that because we had a symptomatic solution, it was an expedient repair, and people might consider that acceptable over a permanent fix. So, for example, people might say, why would you do a root cause analysis? Because it's going to take time and it's going to be expensive. Why bother? We're okay now. We don't need we don't need a fundamental solution here. So, but however, the unintended consequence is that this increases the labor expenses now because if you're going to reboot the system every time it fails, you're going to need a 24/7 presence in the
Dr.
organization to
Ivan,
reboot the presence.
I have a question. Just for the benefit of the audience, could you also explain what is an archetype, and while modeling a problem through system dynamics angle, should we try to identify these archetypes, or so that many of them who do not know what is system dynamics can relate to these 7 types of archetypes?
Yeah, well, an archetype is, if I go back a little bit, an archetype is it's just a type of system dynamics model. It's a very simple system dynamics model that is basically a causal loop diagram that explains the behavior of a system in a qualitative way. So and what these it's actually archetypes were sort of made famous by a book written in 1990 by Peter Senge called The Fifth Discipline. And he brought out I think about a dozen archetypes, and he tried to describe, how these archetypes actually demonstrated the loops and the relationships between variables that recurred in many systems. So basically, they're recurring patterns in systems, and like I said, because they happen often, they could be quite useful. Because, like I said, once you understand archetypes, you'll see them everywhere you look. So they're just models. They're a type of a system dynamics model. It's a qualitative model, and it's a type of system dynamics model that can be applied to many systems. So instead of building one model for one system, this is actually one model for many systems. So it's a model that recurs in many different systems.
Thank you.
So anyway, and as I said, it's a combination of reinforcing and balancing loops. Again, it's just completely qualitative. Does that help, Angela?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sorry I went over that too quickly, maybe. Okay, so as I said, we have this shifting the burden archetype, and we saw that we had two balancing loops and a reinforcing loop, and so in the defensive example in security, we might think of quick patches to security problems that ignore core issues. So that's shifting the burden. So instead of looking at the core issue, the problem, we look at just doing a symptomatic solution of a quick patch. In an offensive example, it could be overused tools that trigger stronger defenses. So you have a symptomatic use of a tool that you use it over and over, but it triggers a problem because you have stronger defenses because it's recognized. And so the recommendation here is from the shifting the burden model. It suggests that we should invest in root cause solutions. So instead of looking at symptomatic solutions, we should look at root cause solutions. Okay, the second archetype is called Tragedy of the Commons, and I think everyone is familiar with this Tragedy of the Commons archetype from economics. It involves competing for shared security resources in security example. And here's the archetype. It's a little bit more complicated. It involves two reinforcing loops and two balancing loops. The idea, though, is fairly simple. We have a CPU resource, and it's a limited resource, and we have two competing processes. We have a mission process, which is maybe the function that we want to actually accomplish, and then we have an anti-malware process B that is also using the CPU. And basically, the more successful the mission, the more gain we get. So A's activity leads to A's gain, which leads to more of A's activity, which is a reinforcing loop. And again, the malware process, the more activity of the malware, the more security you get, and the more security, the more activity of the malware possibly. So then, now that both of these processes are using the same CPU, and so after a delay where they're continually growing their usage of the CPU, there could become a delay in the gain for each individual. So that we have a negative sign between total activity and gain per individual. And that leads to a reduction in the gain per individual. That reduction leads to a reduction in A's gain and a reduction in B's gain, which then leads to a reduction in B's activity and a reduction in A's activity. And so that's the challenge, is that we have the more these two organizations use the same resource, the less resource they'll have to use in the future. So the defensive example is uncoordinated resource usage in security teams. And the offensive example is multiple attackers exploiting the same vulnerability. And then the recommendation is to use strategic resource management, and that's a common recommendation for the Tragedy of the Commons archetype. Okay, fixes that fail are the situation where temporary solutions lead to recurring vulnerabilities. And this is the diagram I showed you before. We have a desired state, which is maybe a configuration compliance standard. And then we have a current state, which is the current state of the configuration compliance. And we see that there's a gap between the current state and the desired state, which leads to action. And the action might be a configuration modification. And then the configuration modification can improve the current state and reduce the gap. However, there is a possible unintended consequence that after a delay, we could go back to the original state, do a reconfiguration reset back to the original state even after the assessment that we should have changed and modified the configuration. So the unintended consequences is that you have this good intention to actually make a change, but after a while, people just go back to doing it the old way. And I think that's a common thing that you've probably seen yourself in many situations. So the defensive example is, for example, IP blocking system mistakenly blocks legitimate users, so the team disables the system. And the offensive example is that ransomware prompts better defenses. And the recommendation is to focus on sustainable solutions. Accidental adversaries. Now, this is very similar to Tragedy of the Commons in many ways, but instead of looking at resources, it's sort of a situation where the processes that people are using are conflicting. So we have conflicting security measures among teams. And the idea here is that we have these many reinforcing and many balancing loops, but it's similar to the limits to the tragedy of the commons, except that these are processes that are, so basically this is also another way to look at this is something called the success to the successful archetype. So here we have A's success on the left-hand side, and A's success leads to more activity toward A. And then we have on the right-hand side, we have B's success, and B's activity leads to more success. And so, however, these two people's success will compete to some extent, so that A's success leads to B's problems of not achieving their goals, and similarly, B's success leads to A's problems achieving their goals. So it's the processes that are involved here, not the resources. So it's just slightly different from the tragedy of the commons. So the defensive example is that IT versus operations priorities might be different, as we know that operations is interested in getting things done, and IT may be interested in security, and the more security, the more difficult it may be to get things done, and so that could be a conflict. In terms of offensive example, competing attackers inadvertently alerting defenders. So this is basically two different attackers or two different groups of an organization are inadvertently attacking the same system and therefore alerting the defenders. And that's creating a problem with their ability to meet their goal. And the recommendation here is to foster collaboration and communication. Okay, drifting goals. Now this is one that everyone knows. I think it's lowering security standards over time. And here's the archetype. It's two balancing loops. And, I think most of you people are probably professors at universities, and you know that drifting goals is very common among students where, they may strive for an A in a course, and then they get a B in the course or a B plus or an A minus or whatever. And then they say, oh, an A minus is good enough. So they let their goals lower because they achieved them rather than keeping them high and striving for the goal. So instead of saying that they didn't achieve their goals, they just lowered their goals to be lower than what they originally suggested they were. So anyways, here in this archetype, we have two balancing loops. So again, we have a compliance standard and an snapshot of the operations, the current state. So the desired standard is the desired state, is the compliance standard. The current state is something that's not quite up to the standard, so there's a gap. And then again, we have actions to improve the system, which improve the current state and reduce the gap. That's the lower circle. And so that's the gap closure activity. However, we have non-compliance, and because there could be pressure to adjust the goal. So basically, that would be someone saying, stop telling us we're wrong, change what you want so we'll be right. So you can see that would reduce the desired state, and by reducing the desired state, it would reduce the gap. So that also closes the gap. If you can close the gap by improving your standards, or you can reduce the gap by reducing your goal. Okay, so the defensive example is reduced compliance thresholds, and the offensive example is settling for less ambitious targets. And the recommendation here is to maintain high standards and strive for improvement. And the last archetype I'm going to talk about today is limits to success. And I think this is something that operational research people will really appreciate. And this is the idea that constraints on growth may be due to limited resources. So this is the classic operations research problem of optimization subject to a constraint. maximization of growth subject to a resource constraint. So I think that this should be a very understandable to most people in operations research. And here's the archetype. So you see we have on the left-hand side we have a reinforcing loop, and on the right-hand side we have a balancing loop. And in the left-hand side we see that we have a security investment that leads to growing action, and the growing action improves the current state, and then the improvement of the current state could lead to more growing action in a reinforcing format. However, we have a limiting state, which is the budget, and the operations budget is limited, and there's alternative needs for the budget. So the improving the current state could actually lead to changes in the budget that lead to reducing the current state. So basically, once you start reaching the threshold of what you're allowed to spend, you're no longer able to improve your state. And so obviously a defensive example is budget or personnel shortages, and an offensive example is possibly skill gaps in using advanced tools. And the recommendation is to balance investments in tools and skill development. And I love this word balance. And I think as operational researchers, you can appreciate this. This is basically saying, what are you getting for your money in terms of your budget? And as we know, you want to be on the Pareto frontier. So you want to be in a situation where you're getting the best return for the dollar you're spending. You don't want to be in a situation where you could get more security for the same amount of money, or the same security for less money, which would be when you're below the Pareto frontier. So basically, this is a very simple thing for most operational research people to appreciate. Okay, that's all my archetypes, and I have a few recommendations for security organizations, and that is to adopt systemic thinking and address root causes. And these come directly from the archetypes. And then foster coordination among teams, allocate resources strategically, commit to continuous improvement and training, and evaluate long-term impacts of strategies. And these are sort of motherhood statements, but as I said, I think you can appreciate how these things come into play with these potential avoidance of unintended consequences. Now, limitations of system dynamics modeling, there's a number. The first is that I specialize in quantitative system dynamics modeling, which uses stock and flow diagrams, which are basically deterministic models of fluid flows in a system, and it uses differential equations, first order differential equations, and it solves them using numerical methods. So you need to have data, you need to have equations, you need to have the system built in a way that you can write the differential equations, and so it's very quantitative. However, when you're looking at causal loop diagrams that are qualitative, converting those qualitative causal loop diagrams to quantitative system dynamics models in stock and flow diagrams is not always obvious. And so that's a limitation with the system dynamics approach. As I said, there's sort of two approaches to system dynamics. There's these causal loop diagrams, qualitative work, and there's the quantitative work of differential equations and simulation and quantitative simulations. And so, like I said, I specialize in the quantitative simulations, and so that may be why I'm not the best person to explain the causal loop diagrams. And then there's obviously the difficulty in modeling unpredictable human behavior and irrational human motivations. So, as this is all about organizations. It's about, say, security, operational people in operational organizations. It's about it's about attackers in hacking organizations, and these people may not be predictable and they may not be rational at all times. So it may be hard to model their behavior and put it into a simulation. That's the challenge. And then there's also a challenge with trying to develop real-time decision making with system dynamics modeling. Generally, system dynamics modeling is very good at long-term work and projections into the future. In terms of real-time decision making, trying to have a quick reaction, I'm not sure that system dynamics might be the best method for that. And the last one is that system dynamics modeling, as you probably got an appreciation of just today, is what they call a data poor methodology. And so it's been criticized because it generally doesn't try to collect a lot of data. Mostly it'll make assumptions and it'll base its work on theoretical extrapolations of those assumptions to their logical conclusions. So so it's assumption based and it's using very limited amounts of data, and that conflicts a lot with decision makers today and leaders today who want evidence-based decision making, and they may not be happy with assumptions that system dynamics people may make. So so there's also these data-driven techniques such as data science, data analytics, machine learning, and all these things. And so integrating system dynamics modeling with data-driven techniques is something that's needed in the future. And I'm going to talk about future work in the next slide. So future research is that we need to adapt system dynamics model to real-time data, as I said in the previous limitation. And here's some applications in security-oriented system dynamics modeling that I haven't seen a lot of literature on. One is the Internet of Things. I haven't seen a lot of SDM on that. The other is cryptocurrencies. Maybe I'm just missing the literature on that. And quantum computing. I think quantum computing is going to be a huge problem for security people in the future. And then the last one is the ethics of using system dynamics modeling for offensive security, and that's basically hacking. But one of the things I think might be interesting here is that let's say that there's unintended consequences with an offensive operation. As a defensive person, you might want to try to trigger the unintended consequences of the intended consequences of the hacker. So if you could somehow use your knowledge of archetypes to trigger these negative unintended consequences in the hacking, you might be able to actually do better at your defensive operations. Okay, key takeaways here is maybe there's a value in system dynamics modeling in anticipating long-term security impacts, and how archetypes can be used to anticipate unintended consequences. And like I said, it's so important to recognize that every action you take has both an intended and an unintended consequence. And the need for systemic thinking to enhance security resilience. And here's some references. You probably can't read them, but there's one reference here that I want to just highlight. It's near the bottom. You can see it maybe Keith Willett, Keith E. Willett and Ivan Taylor, System Dynamics Modeling Archetypes and Security in COSI International Symposium 2025, Ottawa, Canada, July 26th to 31st, 2025. And like I said, that's the paper I wrote. It's a short paper. We wrote it based on this presentation for the NCOSI conference. And if you're interested in getting that paper, just feel free to contact me. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I'll open the floor to questions. I think we have lots of time for questions if there are any.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor, for your insights and great presentation. So the floor is now open for questions. Please ask any questions if you have to Dr. Taylor. Okay, so I will maybe just begin. So Dr. Taylor, system dynamics, as we see nowadays, is becoming more popular, and many researchers are using it to solve or to model complex problems. However, in system dynamics, when we are developing causal loop diagrams, the relationship between the variables for new type of problems or problems which are exploratory in nature, what is your advice on the relationship building between the different variables? Often we rely on statistics or other type of data, but there may be instances such as, for example, the drone problem, one of the speakers talked about today. So let's say if we are investigating drone applications in logistics and we want to use system dynamics modeling to investigate its application in the area. So in that case, maybe we are not aware of a relationship between all the variables, system variables. So do you have any advice on new researchers who are trying to develop the system dynamics models and want to identify the relationship between these variables? Sometimes we use judgment and may use, direct relationship or indirect relationship, but in reality, it may be, I don't know, there may be a nonlinear relationship, or it may be x square versus x and so on. So how flexible we are there, and what are, the concerns we should be worried about if we do not have exact data to model exact relationship between the variables. So how to proceed in those cases?
Yeah, that's a really important question now, and I have to answer that question all the time in my work. And one of the things I think that I recommend for especially for young people I'm mentoring is when they start to work on a problem, they should immerse themselves in time series data. So they should collect as much time series data on the problem and the variables in the problem as they can find, and really immerse themselves in the data and try to understand what the patterns in that data is. And as you say, these patterns are often nonlinear. So statistics will only get you so far in looking in understanding the patterns. You have to actually look at graphical displays of the time series to actually appreciate some of the nonlinearities in the data. So first of all, like I said, you collect time series data and you immerse yourself in it. And then what I generally try to do is it's recommended by the people in system dynamics to build a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is basically a causal loop diagram, and build a hypothesis that it's called a dynamic hypothesis, but build a causal loop diagram that actually could explain the patterns in the data. So what in system dynamics we call the data, we call it reference modes. So we have these reference modes that are historical patterns in the data. And then we have to try to develop a hypothesis in terms of a causal loop diagram as to why these patterns happened, and how did these patterns happen in the data based on some kind of causal relationships. And then once you have that, you can start thinking about developing equations, and then you can build your equations and run your model as a system of differential equations, and then you can go back and like, for example, the thing about system dynamics is we're interested in the future. We want to know what's going to happen in the future, and so that's important. However, if you talk to a decision maker about your model, first thing he'll ask is, how did it do in the past? Did your model actually replicate the past behavior? So you have to what we call calibrate the model. So we calibrate the model to the data, to try to show that, yes, this model can actually model things that have happened in the past. And then hopefully that builds confidence that the model is a valid structure for the system. And then we can say, now we have a valid structure for the system, and we can use that structure to project into the future what behavior might happen in the future. So there's definitely a methodology there that is used for building models, and it does, although I said that System Dynamics is data poor, I really think that it doesn't have to be. When I collect time series data and calibrate the model to data, then I find that I have collected a lot of data, and so for example, a recent model that I built, I collected 10 years worth of daily stock market data on a company, and I used that data to fit my model to the data, and it got me a nice fit to 10 years worth of daily data. So that's a lot of data. So yeah, so
Sure.
that's the kind of thing that we would do, like I said, to try to generate those relationships, like you said.
Okay, thank you. Brandon has a question. He asked, Brandon, would you like to put your question? He asks, does this framework take any theory or ideas from structural causal models or potential outcomes?
Structural causal models. Yeah, I think it's definitely the same concept. Structural causal models. Um, I don't know exactly what Brandon's referring to, but I will sometimes present my models in matrix format, where I have all the variables on the x-axis and all the variables on the y-axis of a matrix. And then I'll put plus and minus signs in the cells to represent the positive and negative connections between those variables in a causal connection. Now, causality is a very difficult concept, to prove. Like I said, you can say for sure that if you don't have correlation, you don't have causality. But proving causality is a very difficult thing to prove. Maybe there's techniques that I'm not familiar with, and maybe Brandon, some techniques for proving causality, but I don't use them myself.
So
Hope that
are there
helps,
any more?
Brandon.
Sure. Are there any more questions for the speaker? If not, then we would like to thank Dr. Yvonne Taylor for according us his important time and presenting to us about the various system archetypes. It was great knowing about your work and to
Yeah.
listen
Yeah,
to
and
the presentation.
another thing is, I hope you'll share the video with me.
Yes, indeed, I will after the
I'll post it
talk.
on my YouTube I'll post it on my LinkedIn channel. So
Sure,
if
it
anyone
will.
wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'd be happy to connect, and you can see
Sure.
all my videos there.
Sure, I think it will be of great value to our audience as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. It was great having you with us, and I will
Okay.
share the link once it is ready. Have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
And thank you to everybody for attending. Have a nice day.